Good morning, everyone. It is time for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Chapter 14, Mr. Willy Wonka. I've got my hat here to go with the story. Now, if you recall, in the last chapter, we had a little experience for Charlie where there was a bunch of people from all over watching him and all the other children before they entered the factory. And we ended up where there was a certain somebody who had just emerged from the rusty hinges of the gate, and we are going to find out who that certain somebody is right now. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory. And what an extraordinary little man he was! He had a black top hat on his head. He wore a tailcoat made of beautiful plum-colored velvet. His trousers, or like pants, were bottle green. His gloves were pearly gray. And in one hand he carried a fine gold-topped walking cane. Covering his chin there was a small, neat, pointed black beard, a goatee, it's called, and his eyes were most marvelously bright. They seemed to be sparkling and twinkling at you all the time. The whole face, in fact, was alight with fun and laughter. And oh, how clever he looked, how quick and sharp and full of life. He kept making quick little movements with his head, cocking it this way and that, and taking in everything with those bright, twinkling eyes. He was like a squirrel in the quickness of his movements, like a quick, clever old squirrel from the park. Suddenly, he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow, and he spread his arms wide and he smiled at the 5 children who were clustered near the gates, and he called out, "Welcome, my friends, welcome to the factory." His voice was high and fluty. "Will you come forward, one at a time, please," he called out, "and bring your parents? Then show me your golden ticket and give me your name. Who's first?" The large boy stepped out. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he said. "Augustus!" cried Mr. Wonka, seizing his hand and pumping it up and down with a terrific force. "My dear boy, how good to see you! Delighted, charmed, overjoyed to have you with us. And are these your parents? How nice! Come in, come in. That's right, step through the gates." Mr. Wonka was clearly just as excited as everybody else. "My name," said the next child to go forward, "is Veruca Salt." "My dear Veruca, how do you do? What a pleasure this is. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I always thought that a verruca was a sort of wart that you got on the sole of your foot. But I must be wrong, mustn't I? How pretty you look in that lovely fur coat. I'm so glad you could come. Dear me, this is going to be such an exciting day. I do hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. I know you will. Your father, how are you, Mr. Salt? And Mrs. Salt? Overjoyed to see you. Yes, the ticket is quite in order. Please go in." The next 2 children, Violet Beauregard and Mike TV, came forward. And here's a little visual here of Miss Veruca Salt with Mr. Willy Wonka. So the other 2 came forward to have their tickets examined and then to have their arms practically pumped off their shoulders by the energetic Mr. Wonka. And last of all, a small, nervous voice whispered, "Charlie Bucket?" "Charlie!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, well, well. So there you are. You are the one who found your ticket only yesterday, aren't you? Yes, yes, I read all about you in this morning's papers. Just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad, so happy for you. And this, your grandfather? Delighted to meet you, sir. Overjoyed and raptured, enchanted. All right, excellent. Is everybody in now? 5 children, yes, good. Now, will you please follow me? Our tour is about to begin. But do keep together. Please don't wander off by yourselves. I shouldn't like to lose any of you at this stage of the proceedings. Oh, dear me, no." Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron entrance gate slowly closing behind him. The crowds on the outside were still pushing and shouting. Charlie took a last look at them, then at the gates. And then, as the gates closed with a clang, all sight of the outside world disappeared. "Here we are," cried Mr. Wonka, trotting along in front of the group. "Through this big red door, please. That's right, it's nice and warm inside. I have to keep it warm inside the factory because of the workers. My workers are used to an extremely hot climate. They can't stand in the cold. They'd perish if they went outdoors in this weather. They'd freeze." "But who are these workers?" asked Augustus Gloop. "All in good time, my dear boy," said Mr. Wonka, smiling at Augustus. "Be patient, you shall see everything as we go along. Are all of you inside? Good. Would you mind closing the door? Thank you." It might be a good moment at this point to stop and think about Mr. Willy Wonka as a character. How would you describe him? What are some of his character traits? And why do you think that these are his traits? For example, is he a grumpy person? Is he a silly person? What do you think? Okay. Charlie Bucket found himself standing in a long corridor that stretched away in front of him as long as he could see. Now, I have to stop for a second because that word corridor, I'm not really sure what that means. It says a long something stretched in front of him so that he could see down it. Something that he's looking down. He just entered a building. So it makes sense to me. They're talking about like a long room or what kind of room is long? Maybe a hallway. It could be a hallway. He's looking down a hallway. There we go. The corridor or hallway was so wide that a car could easily have been driven along it. And that makes sense that it would be a hallway because usually you don't think of a hallway being that wide. But in this case, it is. It's different than what he expected. The walls were pale pink. The lighting was soft and pleasant. "How lovely and warm," whispered Charlie. "I know, what a marvelous smell," answered Grandpa Joe, taking a long, deep sniff. All the most wonderful smells in the world seemed to be mixed up in the air around them. The smell of roasting coffee and burnt sugar and melting chocolate and mint and violets and crushed hazelnuts, like what's in Nutella, and apple blossom and caramel and lemon peel, and far away in the distance from the heart of the great factory came a muffled roar of energy, as though some monstrous, gigantic, mechanic machine were spinning its wheels at breakneck speed. "Now this, my dear children," said Mr. Wonka, raising his voice above the noise. "This is the main corridor. Will you please hang your coats and hats on the pegs over there, and then follow me? That's the way. Good. Everybody ready? Come on, then. Here we go." He trotted off rapidly down the corridor with the tails of his plum-colored velvet coat flapping behind him, and the visitors all hurried after him. It was quite a large party of people when you came to think of it. There were 9 grown-ups and 5 children, 14 in all. So you can imagine that there was a good deal of pushing and shoving as they hustled and bustled down the passage, trying to keep up with a swift little figure in front of them. "Come on," cried Mr. Wonka. "Get a move on, please. We'll never get round today if you dawdle like this." Soon he turned right off the main corridor into the slightly narrower passage. Then he turned left, then left again, then right, then left, then right, then right, then left. The place was like a gigantic rabbit hole with passages leading this way and that in every direction. "Don't you let go of my hand," whispered Grandpa Joe. "Notice how all these passages are sloping downwards," called Mr. Willy Wonka. "We are now going underground. All the most important rooms in my factory are there." "Why's that?" somebody asked. "There wouldn't be nearly enough space for them up on top," answered Mr. Wonka. "These rooms we're going to are enormous. They're larger than football fields. No building in the world would be big enough to house them. But down here underneath the ground, I've got all the space I want. There's no limit. So as long as I hollow it out." Mr. Wonka turned right. He turned left. He turned right again. The passages were sloping steeper and steeper down now. And after that, that is the close of our chapter. Thank you.